Now, let's go back to the subject we were talking about before. Russia's been forced to lock down 14 border villages in its Belgorod region due to the Ukrainian fight back against Russian attacks on the Kharkiv region across the border. Now, this comes as Russia and Ukraine swapped 95 prisoners of war with each other in their latest exchange deal. This happens not that often, but it does happen quite regularly. According to Ukraine's coordination headquarters for prisoners of war, some of those who were released yesterday spent more than 2 years in captivity. They were captured in Mariupol during Russia's early offensive in that Kiev region. It also confirmed that just over 3,500 people, both civilians and military, have returned from Russian captivity since the outbreak of the war. 3,400, I think, is the actual figure. So what is going on? And is there any sign of peace? Joining us now to tell us more is historian and Russia specialist Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Marcus, thanks for coming back onto today's News Talk. Is Ukraine starting to make any dent at all, or is this just a temporary thing?
There is no such thing as a, quote, Ukrainian fights back. That is propaganda which is being peddled by both British mainstream media and American mainstream media in order to justify the billions of pounds of British taxpayers' money and the billions of dollars of American taxpayers' money, which is being sent to Zelensky and his associates. For over a year now, the Russian High Command has employed a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts, in which the Russian military is bleeding to death NATO's Ukrainian army and, by proxy, NATO itself. This strategy commenced last summer in 2023, when the Ukrainian army launched its so-called counteroffensive, which, of course, was not a counteroffensive. Instead, it was a suicide mission designed for propaganda purposes. And ever since then, the Russian army has invited the Ukrainian army to attack it in Lugansk, in Donetsk, and in Zaporozhye, and since the beginning of this year, in the oblast of Kharkov. And as a result, the Ukrainian army has incurred tens of thousands of losses. To date, the Ukrainian army has incurred over 1.5 million losses, of which over 600,000 are fatalities. So Russia, contrary to what Western mainstream media has been saying ever since February of 2022, Russia is winning this war. Yes, the Russian army has made mistakes. The Russian military is a colossus, is a juggernaut. Sometimes it can be clumsy, sometimes it can be disorganized, and sometimes it can be efficient. But history tells you that once this almighty steamroller gets going, it crushes all before it. And that is what we are seeing in Ukraine now.
We had Sir Gerald Howarth, former Conservative MP, in the first hour, who caused actually quite a storm in the chat by assumptively suggesting that we had to carry on supporting Ukraine, that it was a good thing that Keir Starmer, the Labour Prime Minister, is continuing this policy. What you're saying is that's a complete misunderstanding of the situation.
Indeed. For nearly 20 years, Lembit, I was saying on television, on radio, in opinion pieces, in speeches, and in a book I wrote, that there will be a war in Ukraine. And this war will revolve around NATO expansion. How would America respond if there was a Russian-led military alliance in Mexico? If such a scenario ever materialized, I would be one of the first to condemn that, because the two superpowers have to have their national security ensured. If they do not have their national security ensured, that is when there is a risk, and I emphasize a risk, of a military confrontation between the two superpowers, which, of course, would rapidly escalate into a nuclear war between the two superpowers. So this war could have been avoided. Russia has a right to national security. Ukraine is absolutely central, not just to the Russian national identity, but also to Russian national security. If Ukraine was ever to be admitted to NATO, which it never will be, but hypothetically speaking, then Ukraine would be full of NATO troops and NATO weaponry, including NATO missiles. Furthermore, as a result of that, NATO tactical aircraft based in, let's say, the Oblast of Kiev could reach Moscow in about 12 to 15 minutes. The nuclear parity between America and Russia would be severely destabilized, so much so that the Russian nuclear strategic deterrent would be severely impaired. So this is a very, very dangerous war. Do I believe that it will result in a third world war? No, I do not. Because Washington and Moscow, ever since the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, have created and sustained various mechanisms to ensure there will never be a war between themselves. That is something the ordinary person in the world does not understand, and that is certainly something that the average person in British mainstream media and American mainstream media is not only ignorant about, but also would never understand.
A comment from D. Scatty, all those young Ukrainian lives lost in a meaningless war. How can these globalists like Boris Johnson and Vladimir Zelensky live with themselves? Would it be fair to add Joe Biden's name to that list and now Keir Starmer's name as people who are peddling a war which doesn't directly cost American and British lives, but is costing Russian and Ukrainian lives for no greater purpose than postponing the inevitable peace talk?
Anyone, Lembit, who is complicit in this war, be it politicians or mainstream journalists or so-called experts in think tanks in countries such as America and in Britain, have blood on their hands. Again, this war was avoidable. In 1990, the Americans, the Germans, the French, and the British gave a verbal assurance to Mikhail Gorbachev, the then Soviet leader, that in return for the Soviet Union allowing East Germany and West Germany to reunite, NATO will not expand beyond Germany's borders. Indeed, Gorbachev was told not 1 inch eastwards. But Gorbachev, being the utterly inept leader that he was, did not get the West to put this assurance into writing. And when people say that NATO is a defensive organization, well, what is that based on? On what British and American politicians and journalists tell them? Let me cite just one example, Lembit, which refutes that argument. In 1999, NATO bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Not only did that violate international law, but it also violated Article 1 of NATO's own founding treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty, which stipulates that NATO will never use force to resolve a dispute. Then we have NATO's assistance to Islamist terrorists in Libya in 2011, and then NATO's assistance to Islamist terrorists in Syria. So whereas before 1999, the argument could have been made that NATO was a defensive military bloc, ever since 1999, that argument is not only utterly untenable, but it is utterly laughable.
Last question. By the way, I find your erudition on the subject refreshing because, as you said, the mainstream media would regard you as little short of a traitor for daring to suggest that the Ukraine situation shouldn't be supported by the West. But the final question is this: how does this end? And when does it end?
I have said from day one of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine that the Russian army will capture either all or most of Ukraine. At the very minimum, the Russian army will advance to the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, which is, if you're looking at a map of Ukraine, to the west of Kiev. From there, I am not so sure, because in the westernmost part of Ukraine, that is where you find overwhelming anti-Russian sentiment amongst the populations there, such as in Lvov, Ternopil, and Ivano-Frankivsk. Why? Because those regions were for centuries ruled by the Poles, the Lithuanians, and the Austrians. So something tells me that the Russian army will not advance to those regions, but the rest of Ukraine, the lands which comprise Ukraine from the Donbass all the way to Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, I have no doubt will be captured by the Russian army and will be absorbed into the Russian Federation. And as for Western mainstream media regarding someone like myself as, quote, a traitor, well, I'm not the one who has taken part in the erosion of the British national identity. I'm not the one who has taken part in the annihilation of Britain's cultural and spiritual values. I'm not the one who is providing a cover for immigrants from outside of the Western world being brought into the Western world to destroy the Western world from within. I believe that the British national identity must be preserved at all costs. So I will tell you, Lembit, who the traitor is: those wretched, useless men and women at Westminster, and those wretched, useless men and women who comprise British mainstream media.
Thank you so much for your clarity of thought. And I think you've just earned yourself a place on my Saturday omnibus when we can get into these subjects for an hour, if you're willing to give us 1 hour of your time on the forthcoming Saturday.
Thank you very much. That would be my pleasure, Lembit.
It would be my honor, actually. Thank you for saying what so many of us believe, but are prevented from saying on the mainstream media. Well, you heard it there. Hopefully that was the antidote to those who were rather annoyed with Sir Gerald Howarth earlier on.